morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the power of focus, which is the second in a series of 4 webinars about the content that's going to be published in my upcoming book, The Outstanding Organization, coming out in July. And then after the book is out, I'm going to go into a much deeper dive on a series of webinars about some of the specific approaches and practices I recommend in the book. So before we get going, let's take a look at some housekeeping issues for those of you who may be new with the GoToWebinar way the system works. Is that you should be looking at there's two different things you should be looking at to follow along with today's webinar. One is the viewer window, which has my PowerPoint slides up on it. And by the way, for those of you who entered late, the PowerPoint slides are available, and there's a link on the confirmation email you received where you can go in and download either a full slide version or 2 slides per page, whichever you prefer. And then also there's a control panel, and in the control panel you'll see a little arrow that allows you to minimize or maximize that control panel. Just so you know, you're all muted, so you can make as much racket in the background as you'd like and no one will hear you. However, if you want to be unmuted during the Q&A period at the end for the last 10 or 15 minutes and want to raise your hand and let me know that you'd like to be unmuted, that worked out really well in the last webinar. I really enjoy having those direct conversations rather than everything being written in the question area. If you're listening on your computer using speakers, you are muted, and you want to make sure if you want to ask anything verbally you have a mic. Oftentimes people want to ask and then they realize they don't have a means to ask. And then if you're listening by telephone, make sure that you've entered in the audio pin that's showing on your screen so that you can hear well, and you can also speak if you'd like to speak with us. 2 ways to ask questions. I'll hold questions until the very end. You can either raise your hand, as I mentioned, or you can type your question into the question log any point along the way. Feel free to go ahead and ask those questions as the webinar is progressing, and then I'll get to them at the end. So just for those of you who may not be as familiar with me, although I do see quite a few familiar faces on the list today, I founded my company in 1993, and I focus in lean transformations in the service sector and then also in the office or admin areas within manufacturing. If you want to take a look at the clients I've worked with, they're on my website, which is ksmartin.com, and then there's probably 3 times that number of folks that have attended public workshops from different organizations. In addition to that, I teach at the University of California, San Diego's Lean Enterprise program, which is a really wonderful and very thorough and deep 16-week program. You can email me if you'd like, you can tweet with me if you'd like, or you can also like my Facebook page and join in the conversation on Facebook. 3 books out, the new one's coming out in July, and I'm looking forward to having lots of good conversation and stimulating dialogue about some of the concepts in that book. If you'd like to come to any of the other webinars, May 3rd and May 17th will be the last of the 4. The March 22nd webinar has been recorded and it's posted on my Vimeo site, which you'll see the link there. And then also all the materials are available on my SlideShare site. There's a typo in the materials I sent out earlier. I forgot the last part of that SlideShare URL, which is Karen Martin 2. So if you can add that to your slides if you want to get to that SlideShare site. So I'm not going to go through the whole background of why I wrote the book like I did in the last webinar. You can obviously listen to that on the Vimeo recorded webinar. But the bottom line was that after 20-some years of doing this work, I've just been continually noting that companies aren't being as successful with improvement as they'd like to be and that they need to be. And so this book represents my view of what it's really about and what we really need to do about it. So in the recent years, we've heard an awful lot about leadership. It's leadership, it's culture, and it is that. It's certainly strong leadership will take you miles on the improvement journey. But the thing I'm a little concerned about with putting too much stock in leadership, apologies to any CEOs on the line or even executive VPs, I just don't believe that there are enough stellar leaders for us to put all of our weight in it's a leadership issue. In other words, every profession has a bell-shaped curve of people from stellar all the way down to not so effective and everything else in between. And you've probably experienced that whole bell curve in your career. And so I just have a fundamental discomfort with thinking that we have to rely on leadership to get any better at improvement than where we're at. So I started scratching my head and saying, well, if we can't rely on leadership necessarily, although it certainly helps, what can we do? So clearly we have to improve how we improve. So I started thinking about it, and I started thinking about how what transformation is really about is building, a skyscraper, a robust building, and I believe that we're trying to build it many times on cracked foundations. And when I started looking into, well, what makes the foundation cracked, yes, culture is part of it, but it goes even deeper than that. There are deeper cracks in the foundation that are the mindsets and the behaviors, which of course makes up the culture of an organization, but it doesn't do us much good to talk about culture when we really haven't fully defined what are the elements of what makes a culture either an effective, improvement-oriented culture or not. And as I started looking through all of my clients and organizations that had not been clients, that I've been inside for various reasons, and talking with friends in organizations and reading the literature and all of those things for 20-some years, I realized that there's a fundamental underlying amount of chaos in organizations that's self-inflicted. So there's chaos that comes from the outside that's, really truly unforeseen, like a supplier suddenly is victim to a tsunami or goes belly up, or there's a terrorist act or something like that. I mean, those are truly unforeseen acts. Well, I guess one could argue that 9/11 could have been predicted. We won't go there. But, really, for most of us, 9/11 was completely unforeseen. And so there, we need to reserve bandwidth in order to be able to deal with those truly unforeseen external circumstances that create chaos in the business community. The financial meltdown is another example. What we want to do, though, is take better control of the internal chaos or the self-inflicted chaos that organizations do to themselves. And it's almost like, getting out of your own way to success and building in a stronger foundation that will reduce the amount of chaos that you're dealing with on a regular basis to reserve the bandwidth to deal with the truly unforeseen. So when I started looking at what are the elements of that chaos and where does it come from, I discovered that in all of my clients there were these fundamental lacks. It was, this fundamental lack of clarity, lack of focus, lack of discipline, and lack of engaged workforce, a fully engaged workforce. And then I started studying excellence in other endeavors. I looked at sports and the military and the arts and all the other endeavors outside of the business community, and I said, isn't this interesting that the common elements of excellence as I've been seeing it is that they have this exemplary clarity and really laser focus and great discipline, incredibly well-defined practices and regularity and consistency on how they go about achieving. And then fully engaged. I mean, there's not a star alive. If you look at the arts, you look at music, look at theater, look at even visual arts, there's not an artist alive that isn't 100% fully engaged in performing when they're performing, that's at the top of their game. There are certainly artists, let's look at actors in particular. You can see actors that are not as engaged and they don't act as well. So they're not able to achieve excellence unless they're fully engaged. So those to me are the common elements of excellence, and they also coincidentally are the things that I find missing more often than not at one level or another in an organization. So it can be very low-level chaos and low-level lacks of clarity, focus, discipline, engagement, or it can be completely out of control. And I've been on both ends of it and everything in between. So what my thought was that if you start looking at these fundamental behaviors and build these conditions into the organization, that forms the rebar or the glue that starts repairing those cracks and enables a business to build 3 key core capabilities that's going to enable them to then achieve the results that they're looking for. And those 3 core capabilities are excellence in problem solving, excellence in continuous improvement, and excellence in being a resilient organization. So I view resilience as an outcome, not necessarily an action that gets you somewhere else. The outcome, of course, does lead to business results, but resilience is what we're really looking for, and resilience comes from being stellar at problem solving and continuous improvement. So let's talk today specifically about the lack of focus. And I want to just quickly talk about what focus is in my mind versus clarity. I get that question quite a bit. So I think you can be pretty clear on a variety of issues, but not be able to achieve focus and stay focused on any given project or initiative or improvement or even business strategy at any given time. So it's one thing to be clear, but it's another thing to stay focused on it, limit what you're focusing on, get great with prioritization, and then just knock things off your list. Check, check, check. So to me, you can be incredibly clear but be incredibly unfocused. One of the, I think, most poignant things that we're dealing with in our personal lives right now is this whole, kind of ADD thing, this widespread attention deficit disorder that happens with distraction. And we certainly are living in a time when distraction is far more common, and it's coming at us from so many different directions and so much faster than it ever used to, that it's very tempting to fall prey to distraction. But just like distraction kills on the road, it kills in businesses. And so what we have to do is, again, there are going to be distractions that come out of left field that we've got to take advantage of in the case of a wonderful new opportunity, or we've got to deal with urgently in the case of a fire that's raging out of control. But what we want to do is start minimizing the distractions that are coming our way that we can control more easily, so that, again, we've got the bandwidth to deal with those external distractions that we need to work with. So Booz & Company, a consulting firm, is doing an ongoing survey. They've got kind of a live survey that's been going on for about 12 months now. The numbers aren't shifting much at all now that they've gotten the number in that they've got. I think they're at about 1,400 responses now from CEOs across the country and across the globe, in all industries. And 49% are admitting that they've got no written priorities. To me, that was shocking to hear that CEOs themselves and VPs themselves are admitting that almost 50% of them don't have their priorities even in writing. And then 64% of them said that they've got priorities, they may or may not be in writing, but they're certainly conflicting with one another. And 82% of them said that their functional areas that are shared services such as IT, HR, finance, those types of areas are receiving competing demands from multiple parts of the organization, which is making their lives miserable and making it difficult to get quick results. So those numbers are pointing out that we do indeed have a problem. But one of the things that I find fascinating about looking at success, and there is probably no one more aware of what makes for a successful organization and for successful people as Warren Buffett is. Now, this saying is attributed to him all over the place, although I haven't been able to find the original source, so I'm not willing to say it's definitely Warren Buffett's quote. But he says the difference, or we think he says, the difference between successful people and very successful people is that very successful people say no to almost everything. So one of the first things you start thinking about when you start thinking about focus or the lack thereof is that the reason why we're not having focus is that we're not saying no. We're saying yes far, far too much. So we have to figure out how to shift behavior, break old habits, and start being more comfortable with and being rewarded for saying no versus saying yes. Here's an example of why saying no matters. ThedaCare is one of the greatest success stories we've seen to date. There are several healthcare organizations that have done really well with Lean, but ThedaCare is one of them, perhaps at the top. And what they did was they had 31 initiatives one year when they finally decided to employ strategic deployment. So it's a specific kind of strategic planning for making improvements in an organization. And at that point, they had 31 initiatives in play that were active initiatives. And little by little, through a lot of discussion and some arm wrestling and probably a little bit of duking it out, if they'd be honest, their leadership team was able to reduce those initiatives from 31 to 4. And what you see at the peak here, or at the trough, the trough of their operating margins is when they made the decision to reduce from 31 to 4. And you can see that over the next year or so, there was this remarkable rise in their margins. And look at the date, 2008. 2008 is when the financial meltdown began. So this rise is happening at a point where everyone else is starting to crumble. And in the healthcare industry, what happened in this period was so many people got laid off, they were going on to the either Medicaid rolls, which has virtually no margin, if any at all, or they were losing all benefits and they were just cash paid patients, and so cash paid patients are tough to collect from, and the story was unraveling quickly for healthcare. And we used to think that healthcare was stable during slower economic periods, but healthcare has now become one of like every other industry, that it's not at all a pretty sight when the economy starts tanking. So without any layoffs, they were able to increase and double their operating margins, where 74% of the other hospitals were reporting reduced margins. So then you might wonder, well, what's going on here? Why this drop in operating margins? Well, in reality, everybody, once we started getting further and further along into the recession, it erodes your margins. It goes without saying. And so John Toussaint, the CEO emeritus at ThedaCare, and I interviewed him for my book, and we were talking about it, and he said, I actually don't know what would have happened to us if we hadn't have done that reduction and able to get those huge operating margins when we did to help us weather the storm when times were tough. I'm not sure. It would have been a really ugly scene. And so this is the thing is, we don't know necessarily when these storms are going to come. And if you look at Toyota, they're another stellar operation that went through this external bashing about recalls that ended up not being legitimate concerns. At least they weren't legitimate concerns from Toyota as far as their engineering and manufacturing. But had they not had the cash flow they had and the margins they had, they would not have been in the same seat that they are today, which is that they've, by and large recovered. And that's after they got, the triple whammy of the tsunami and the financial meltdown and the devaluation of the yen and all those things. So, talk about resilience. This is a great example. And now, we're able to study much more deeply how they're able to do it. And it's not just because they do value stream maps. So, I did my own poll because I was curious to see how the group that I interface with is feeling about their organization's ability to focus. And what I found was that 70% of organizations that are subscribers to my newsletter said that their organization is attempting more than or significantly more than what they can reasonably handle. 70% to me is a really high number. And I don't think that, if you look at the group of people that are subscribers to my newsletter, these are either managers, senior managers, VPs, or executives, or they're full-time improvement professionals. That's the bulk of who subscribe to my newsletter. And so these are not people that kind of do a lot of hand-wringing like you see when you get down to the lower levels of an organization. These are people that are typically pretty much, in control of what's going on or what they can control. And for this many people to say, look, we're doing too much, I think is a significant and telling sign on where we are in terms of our ability or the lack thereof to focus. Steve Jobs is another one. If you can think whatever you want to think about Apple, but the reality is that as an organization overall, if you look at everything that they've done, they certainly are an organization to be looked at and taken seriously. And Steve Jobs was notorious for saying no. And so he says he's saying no to 1,000 things to make sure they don't get on the wrong track or try to do too much as part of what made them successful. He said, we're always thinking about new markets we could enter, but it's only by saying no that you can concentrate on the things that are really important. So again, here's a leader who was able to learn to say no, and it benefited him greatly by being able to do that, and the organization, and us, for all of us that are walking around with iPhones. So here's an example again of why and how this can really play out. This is Pactiv, who makes packaging for food products. They make hefty bags and all kinds of different food packaging products. That's their primary product line or product lines. And what they did was they implemented this type of focus and prioritization practice known as strategic deployment or policy deployment, or it's also known as Hoshin Conry. And when they did it in between 07 and 08, you start seeing these pretty decent rises in terms of productivity, and then this big bump in 2011 when they finally got strategy deployment down and were able to get more and more focused on what they're working on. Now this happens to be only one measure. It's productivity based on the number of pounds of product produced per hour worked. But it is one measure that was why they decided to start focusing in and not have so many priorities that they were trying to tackle at any given time. So again, the proof's in the pudding. When you start applying focus, it kind of goes without saying that you're going to be able to get more done. So the reality is you can't do it all, and you can do it well. You can do a lot of things and rush through it, and you'll end up with Band-Aid solutions. You all have lived it. I'm sure you've lived it a lot. And you can also juggle a lot of things and not solve problems deeply enough, or not even in some cases have the problem properly defined to begin with because you're rushing around. And so we really have to start focusing in on what's important and do less at any given time. So this part of the book, when I started looking into focus, I started really looking at that whole notion of strategic deployment, policy deployment, Hoshin-Connery, whatever you want to call it. And I started getting concerned about organizational maturity and whether or not organizations are really mature enough, by and large, to take on this type of practice right away. When they decide that they want to focus, are they ready to dive into strategy deployment? And the answer I found was no, that there are these fundamental behaviors in place that organizations need to build, and they need to practice and build up their muscles, as it were, before they're ready to really dive fully into strategy deployment. So this workshop I gave, or this webinar, is not going to focus on pure Hoshin-Connery. That workshop, or I'm sorry, that webinar, I gave that in December, so if you want to listen to that, you can hear it on Vimeo.com. You can go listen to that. This one's going to focus on a more fundamental way of starting to get focus into an organization. So here's why it really matters. It is impossible to multitask. Impossible. What you can do is you can have two subconscious tasks that you're doing simultaneously, like eating and driving. I'm sorry, eating, not eating and driving, eating and watching television. Eating and driving actually isn't very good. So eating and watching television, that you can do both of those at the same time. They're both kind of, subconscious activities. But it is impossible to do conscious activities at once, two of them, two or more. And a way to challenge yourself on this is to turn on any of the TV shows that have a ticker tape along the bottom. Bloomberg does. I think CNBC does at times. I think Fox Business does. I'm not sure all the channels that do, but look at a ticker tape and watch the ticker tape and try to retain some of the numbers that are going across, or some of the news blurbs if it's just a headline ticker tape, and listen 100% to the reporter or the anchor that's talking. It is impossible. You will not be able to do it. I challenge you. I've been working on this for years. You just can't retain both those things in your head at the same time. So what we're really doing when we think we're multitasking is we're switch tasking. And David Meyer at the University of Michigan was one of the researchers to make the biggest splash about this with his research when he was studying engineers. And he found that engineers switch between projects 5 to 8 times per day. So there are very few engineers that have just one and only one project they're working on. Hopefully that'll change, but current state, unusual. So they switch between 5 and 8 times per day, and every switch added about 20 minutes of process time or task time to what they were doing because of the mental ramp up. So in manufacturing, we've got changeover or setup time that we think about all the time with machinery, but human beings have the same thing. It's known as the mental changeover, or the mental setup in order to start a task. And so when you add that 20 minutes of process time per day, even if they only changed on the lower end of that 5 to 8 times per day, let's say they only changed 5 times per day and switched between projects, that's 1.7 hours per day. That's 407 hours or 10 weeks of process time per engineer per year. If you had 15 engineers in your company, then 3 of them are spending their time just switch tasking. I mean, this is the equivalent of that. That's an awful lot of labor being used for non-value adding time to a customer. So that right there is a compelling statistic to take to leadership as you're educating them and coaching them and helping teach them about what multitasking or switch tasking, as it's really called, is doing to your organization. Now, the other guy that you might want to read, Dave Crenshaw, Crenshaw. He had a book out a couple years ago about multitasking. It's called The Myth of Multitasking, I think. And he has a nice, accessible little book. It's a fictional book about multitasking, but it's a nice little book to read as well. So here's another cool thing that you could try, and I'm not repeating this during this webinar because Dan Markovitz did this, I think it was 2 months ago on the webinar. He showed this when he was doing his personal productivity webinar. But multitasking is a proven thing that you can show your leadership team or your own work team. You can use this with your department if you have people you manage to talk about why multitasking isn't very effective. And what you do is a timed experiment, so you get a stopwatch, and you do 2 rounds of this. So in the first round, you ask people to write the sentence, multitasking is a lie, and the numbers 1 through 18 by alternating between projects. So we would say that multitasking is a lie is one project, and writing the numbers 1 through 18 is a different project. So for round 1, you'd have them start the stopwatch and write M1, U2, L3, T4. I5, where am I? T6. So you have them go back and forth and time themselves until they're complete. Then you have them zero out their stopwatches and have them not switch task and just write the sentence multitasking is a lie first and followed immediately by writing the numbers 1 through 18 and time that. And what you'll find is that round 2 time is about half of the time of round 1. So again, this starts, kind of acclimating people to the reality that multitasking is or switch tasking is a serious drain on labor, and it's frustrating, and it causes errors, and it slows delivery to customers. And there are all these other things other than just the labor expense and time that is a downside of switch tasking. So that's why being able to winnow down the number of initiatives you're working on at any given time, and this is really reducing batch sizes. This happens to be projects and initiatives and improvement, strategic directions of companies. It's all of that stuff, but it's still batch size reduction so that you can get better flow in the system. So here's an example of a product development case where before they put focus in place, they were able to complete 24 product launches per year because they were working on a lot at the same time. And then by putting in focus and doing fewer project launches at any given time, they were able to increase their output to 73 without any additional resources whatsoever, and they anecdotally and qualitatively believed that they were putting out far higher quality. They're still doing some measurement to find out exactly how much higher the quality is, but because they were able to get this high degree of focus into the product development area, then they were able to get engineers, having more bandwidth to do a deeper dive into quality issues and be able to complete it. So this, to me, is an example of where we get very short-term focused, and we're thinking, we've got to do it all, we've got to do it all now. And CEOs are notorious for this. People get to leadership positions because they're very, very good at pushing. But the smart, savvy, self-aware CEOs that are constantly learning are really learning that they have to temper their impatience for results with this need to get fewer things done at any given time so you can complete more in the course of a year. Shareholders will revel in this, so just cut that habit, change that habit right now, and look at the results. Rockwell Automation is another example of an organization that before they put focus in place, they attempted 12 projects simultaneously, and they only completed 3 at the end of the year. Of that 20 that they started, they only completed 3. The following year, they decided to take from 20 attempts, 20 different projects at one time, down to 12. And they were able to complete all 12. And so you have to pick the right number based on the bandwidth and shared resources and all of that. But the point is, you've got to start reducing how many projects or initiatives you're tackling at any given year. So let's talk about you personally. Those of you that are on the line are at all different levels of the organization, from CEOs down to front lines, a few frontline folks. We've got some consultants on the line. We've got, let's see, some people from education. We've got all different industries: healthcare, manufacturing, financial services, government. What else do I see here? Let's see. I see EPA, veterans, the VA, VHA. So we've got, a pretty broad stretch of different people from different industries. So wherever you sit, you can start getting focus built into your organization. And this stuff spreads. When you're successful and you're producing better work in quicker amounts of time over the long haul, people will start taking notice and asking what you're doing, and this will start spreading. So ideally, you've got the CEO at the top of the organization declaring, okay, ladies and gentlemen, from this point forward, we're going to stop this crazy thing where we're trying to do too much at any given time. We're going to focus in on only a few things, help me figure out what they are, and let's try this and see what happens. For many of you, that's just not going to happen. That would be ideal. And so if you're at a division or business unit level, you can do it just for your business unit and decide what you're going to focus in on for your business unit. Let's say you're not that high up and you're the head of a department and you've got some direct reports in your department. You can do it at a department level. And then let's say you're at an individual level. You can actually use all these ideas, you can use them for yourself individually. You may need to lobby your boss or whoever you're interfacing with and sell them on why this is going to work, and ask them to go with you on an experiment where you tackle fewer projects at any given time. You may need to do that. But, we're all born teachers, and we all need to be coaching each other. We need to coach up, sideways, and down the organization. So you can do this. You can go to your boss and say, I'd like to propose something. And then that kind of behavioral shift can happen in a tiny little place and start spreading throughout the company. It may not spread quickly, and it may take years and years and years when it starts at that level and not at the CEO level, but better to start it than not at all. Because frankly, the people that I'm working with and the organizations that I've been in and the people that are coming from the outside into my workshops that represent different organizations are all stressed out. Completely stressed out in some cases. We are doing serious damage to ourselves as far as our mental states, our physical states, and our organizational performance. We've got to stop it. We've got to get off this treadmill and start putting focus. And it's not like you're not going to get things done. You're going to get so much more done. So it's really a matter of breaking very bad, long-standing habits that have been being built into us from every direction in society. It takes a very courageous person to say no to those external influences that we are around every day. So what are you going to do? What specifically are you going to do? I would recommend that you start, if you start nowhere else, just start looking at what improvements need to be made, where, when, and what priorities should they play in the organization. So, like a sports team comes up with a strategy, football teams don't just go out on the field and say, hey, let's just see what they throw at us. No, they're extremely strategic. They know what the other team is going to dish out from studying them, and then they figure out what their strategy is going to be in order to, hopefully beat them, win. So you have to have your own version of that football strategy. What I call the distractions when companies are doing too much, I call it, the shiny ball syndrome or organizational ADD. And to me, it takes three things for you to really slay this dragon. One is you've got to get clear about what really matters. Secondly, you've got to get consensus around what really matters. And third, you have to help people have the courage to actively choose to either not do or not do now. So a couple of places you might want to take a peek back in literature to help you if you're going to be coaching or teaching others in your company. One is in Good to Great. Jim Collins talked a lot about the stop doing list, and he talks about it again in his new book, Great by Choice. Also, Matt May, in his books, The Elegant Solution and In Pursuit of Elegance, both of those books talk about, stop doing and that whole thing. And his new book, which is coming out in October, I believe it is, called The Laws of Subtraction, it's all about stop doing. The Laws of Subtraction, Matthew E. May. So let's talk about these one by one. How do you actually do this? How do you get clarity about what really matters? So if you're at a place in the organization where you can learn what the business goals are that the executives set out, whether or not they've communicated them or not, whether or not it's in writing or not, ask. Leaders, I talk to leaders all the time, and they express this frustration because they feel that the improvement professionals in their organizations are disconnected with what the overall goals of the business are. And I think both parties carry responsibility for this problem. I think leaders think that they communicate a lot more than they really do communicate, and they think they're communicating clearly, and they aren't necessarily. But I also think improvement professionals sometimes don't listen, or they are sometimes afraid to ask clarifying questions. And last week I had 2 calls from 2 people that were so frustrated because they didn't know, where to focus and all these things. And I kept asking the question, well, have you asked your leadership that question? Have you asked your leadership that question? And every single time it was, well, no. Sometimes they were afraid. Sometimes they felt like the leader was too busy. You know what? You gotta break that habit. If you don't understand what the leadership team wants you to be working on, you've got to ask the question. Don't wait for them to tell you. Ask the question. Next, consensus. Here is the tricky part, because if you're one person in a big organization and you're sold on this focus thing, you're going to have to sell a lot of people on focus and then get consensus around winnowing down the number of projects you're working on or initiatives or improvement areas you're working on at any given time. So this is going to be a great developmental test for all of you to get good at lobbying. And who knows, maybe some of you will go into politics after this. You need to help people understand why it's important, and you need to help people reach consensus. Now, what does consensus mean? Does it mean that everyone says, yes, I agree 100% with this list we've come up with? No, it does not. What it means is that everyone says, yes, I agree to work on this list because it is in the greater good of the company, and I very much value this whole thing that we're trying to do with focus. I see the benefits of this already, and I'm going to work this list with you. I may not agree with what's on that list, but I'm going to work the list. So consensus is agreement to move forward, even if they have disagreement about individual things on that list. The way you get that agreement about the list, however, is by having deep conversations about why people don't believe something should be on the list, or they believe something should be on the list that's not. Listening carefully, listening deeply. It's people needing to be heard and have their views carefully considered, and then they decide anyway that they're going to go ahead and go along with the plan. That's what consensus is. So it's a lot easier to get that than it is to get everyone saying, yes, I agree with everything on this list. So how do we get consensus? Well, we need to take a lesson from strategy deployment, which was developed back in the 50s in the total quality management days, and then Toyota picked it up and ran with it, and now many other organizations are as well, and seeing great benefits from it. But there's this concept known as catchball. And catchball is this ongoing dialogue back and forth within the different levels or layers of the organization so that you're achieving consensus along the way. So rather than a top-down command and control or mandate coming from the executives, here's what we're going to work on this year. And this is what happened back in my day. This is what we're going to work on. It was handed down to a division level, and the VPs would say then to the management team, here's what we're going to work on. And then we would say to our staff, here's what we're going to work on. And so it was a very much top-down approach. Catchball is not a bottom-up approach, but it's a back-and-forth approach where ideally throughout the year, not just when you're putting your plan together, but throughout the year, you have much more engaged and open conversations about what's working, what's not, where do we need to go, why do we need to go there, why is this a priority, so that by the time you get to the planning stage, everyone's already sort of aligned on what you need to be working on. What happens all too often is companies say, okay, it's time to plan our strategic goals for the next year, and the executive team has been operating in a silo all year. They have no idea what's really going on the front lines, and so things get misaligned that way, and that's what causes organizational chaos, and that is certainly not a path to becoming an outstanding organization. So catchball needs to happen throughout the year. Now, most of my clients have not done catchball throughout the year. So when I walk in the door, we are in fact starting catchball on day one of the first time that we're planning what the priorities are going to be. So in that case, it's a facilitated discussion. I highly recommend you have it be a carefully facilitated discussion within the executive team first and get them somewhat aligned on what's important and winnowing down the list first at an executive level. And I got to tell you, I've been doing this a lot this year. It's hard, and it's not something that happens quickly with most executive teams, but at the end of it, develop thick skin, you'll need it. At the end of it, they are so aligned because they've done that duking it out, in a conference room or offsite or whatever, where they've really thought and they've learned and they've understood that they didn't know enough about what their customers really needed, and they didn't know enough about certain areas. So it really is a very healing and necessary step to moving forward on having focus. And then what I prefer is taking the executive team with the next level down together in the same room at the same time and facilitating that discussion. And at this point, nothing is set in cement. The executives have said what they think needs to be worked on and why, but they are, I'm coaching them to be extremely open to hearing the next level down and saying, I don't know about that. I think we need to be working on this, and this is why. And then there's this, dialogue going back and forth in this organizational learning that perhaps has never happened before. And then down and down. Now, in most organizations that are hierarchical, there are at least 4 levels that would be ideally worth including in this whole process. I recommend the first year you've done this, if you've never done it before, that you only take it down 2 levels. And, it's not ideal, but again, you're reshaping behaviors and reframing conversations. And so if you try to tackle too much and go too fast, it's likely to be of a bit of a not as helpful as if you take it step by step. I heard, what was that guy? Paul Calderazzo, I think is his name, from Terex. He used to be part of the Genie Corporation, and Genie was acquired by Terex. And he talked about their 3-year journey, where the first year it was just 1 level, and the second year it was 2 levels, and the third year it was 3 levels. I'm only on my first client where we're taking it down the second year now into 3 levels. And he said that it definitely is, a tougher thing to take it down to all 4 levels, and it takes a while to get there. But ideally it goes all the way down to the front lines. So I recommend you use catchball wherever you're at, even if it's within a department level. Take it, 1 level and get consensus around what really matters. And then finally, and the hardest part, is the courage to not do and to decide what you're going to either push off to the following year or you're not going to do it at all. So here's what I would recommend you do for that. First, after you've had your clarity, list every single thing that you could do improvement-wise and include what you are doing. So for a client I just did this with a couple months ago, we ended up with 53 things on the list. And these were big projects. This wasn't 53 little things where they're moving a piece of equipment from here to there. These were big projects. And that in and of itself gave them such clarity around where they were really at and a deeper understanding of why they weren't getting anything accomplished, because that was just way too much given the number of the staff they had. Then categorize that big list into 3 buckets. There's the must-do. You absolutely have to do this. Can't fail at those. The eliminates, like, why are we doing that? That was needed 3 years ago. We don't need to do that now. and then the maybes. And of course the maybe group will be your biggest list. Then you take your maybes and you decide what you will do and what you're not going to do. And that is the hardest part. The must-do, can't fails is usually fairly easy to get consensus on. The eliminate is often fairly easy to get consensus on. The maybes are where you get into some really good, rich dialogue. And again, you know, these are tough conversations often, and they should be, because for the first time ever, people are all together deciding what the organization is going to commit to, and so there's a lot of, you know, people trying to get their favorite project on the table and all that. So it does need to be facilitated. And then create the plan. So we'll talk about the plan in a second, but the most important thing about a plan is that the plan can't become the vehicle that everyone's focused on. It's the planning process that needs to be what everyone's focusing on. And plans can't be set in cement. We want them to be fairly stable, but they can't possibly be set in cement where if you go down the path of improvement, for example, and you discover something that no one knew before, you don't continue moving on just because it's on a plan. And I see that a lot. You know, people on a project team, for example, will discover something and then they'll really want to change the direction, and the leadership's like, nope, it's on the plan. So that's misuse of a plan. So, you know, planning you have to find that sweet spot between being flexible and using new information that's coming up to flex the plan, and also being somewhat stable on the plan so you don't have distraction and organizational ADD. I recommend you manage that plan through weekly updates. If you want to learn about a pretty effective process, from what I'm hearing, Ford, looking at how Alan Mulally has done his weekly updates is great. I have a client that adopted his method, and it's just fantastic. There are dashboards, quick meetings. They don't talk about what's on track. They only talk about what's stalling or late. And how everyone can rally around to help the person that's the owner on that particular project or priority. So what I would recommend as far as prioritizing and how you do that is to use a very simple tool, very, very coarse but simple tool, where you look at how easy it's going to be to accomplish something and what the benefit's going to be from low to high. You've got to define those parameters a bit more, you know, specific than what I have. And then rank all of the different lists. This you could use for your maybes, for example. And then what you want to do is tackle the ones that are going to be the easiest and the highest benefit first, so you get good organizational traction and you build momentum. People like seeing things accomplished. It builds a tremendous amount of momentum. And then work your way down. When you get your priority section completed, you are going to want to rethink the rest of them, because once you make any shift in an organization, your set point changes. So what used to look difficult or lower benefit may look easier or higher benefit, and vice versa. So you have to rethink your priorities once you get your first round done. Now, there's a third dimension that I realized as I've been using this for years and years and years was missing, and that's urgency. So in the book, I talk about a third dimension being added to the prioritization grid, and it's about urgency. And I've actually switched the math on the axes so that now, rather than the upper left quadrant being where you tackle first, it's going to be with the upper right quadrant based on mathematical calculations. So the bubble chart allows you to assign urgency, and the size of the bubbles reflects how urgent the improvement or priority or project, whatever you want to call it, is. So that's a third dimension. I'm kind of playing around with this and creating the formula right now. For an annual improvement plan, it can look extremely basic. You can get fancy with Microsoft Project and all those things. I'm not a big believer in fancy software. I think that just something very clear where you've got all of the key priorities listed on one side, when you're going to begin and when you anticipate completing it, who the executive owner is, and again, if this is at a department level, it would be lower down in the organization, and then others that need to be involved. And in this case, this company has a fiscal year that starts October 1st, and so we had actually a whole list of, we already know pretty much based on the knowledge we've got today what their priority is going to be for fiscal year 2013. I'm very sure those will shift by the time we get to October, based on new conditions. But at this stage of the game, their plate's already full for 2013. So it'll be a matter of deciding what comes off that list as new conditions necessitate adding things to the list. So, in summary, Ryan Morgan wrote this wonderful and created a great illustration of creating ideas, and he says, creating new ideas is a gift, but choosing wisely is a skill. I really believe this. I believe that any skill can be taught, any behavior can be broken, new behaviors can replace, less effective behaviors, but you have to practice, and you can start practicing anywhere in the organization, and it'll get easier and easier and easier as you start saying no to things or putting things off and allowing yourselves the bandwidth to get work done well, get it aligned with what the organizational needs really are. And this is where we start finally seeing improvement actually make its way to the bottom line, actually make its way to market share gains, actually make its way to where there's huge shifts in the morale and the level of engagement of the workforce, is through bringing in this kind of focus, along with, of course, clarity, discipline, and engagement. So that's a little bit about focus. I'm looking forward to some questions. We've got a little bit of time for that. Book's coming out July 8th, or about there. It's available for pre-order right now if you want. And if you want to connect with me, again, there's a whole bunch of ways you can do that, and definitely join us on social media. For those of you who aren't on Twitter yet, I have to tell you, it is getting really fun in the Lean community on Twitter. In the beginning days, there were only a few people on that were active, but now there's a huge global community of Lean people on Twitter, and I really recommend you join it up. It took me a while to figure it all out and find that sweet spot with how to make Twitter effective, but I'm learning more through using Twitter and being active on Twitter than I have any other means of learning. So I recommend it. All right, so let's go ahead and take some questions. I see some coming in already. And whoa, I see a lot. Okay, so first question is, did I hear you summarizing resilience as an outcome of being good at problem solving and working on continuous improvement, which are the other two pillars? Yes. So it's not linear. I'm not suggesting that it's exactly linear, that first you get good at problem solving, then you get good at continuous improvement, then you get good at resilience, and you get resilience. I'm not suggesting that. They certainly do all go back and forth with one another. Like, for example, I think the more resilient you get, and the more you weather storms as an organization, the more you get excited about the fact that the thing that got you there was being fanatic, using Jim Collins' new term, fanatic about improvement and about problem solving, and so then you get even deeper skills built across the organization in improvement and problem solving. So they aren't linear, they play on one another, but yes, I would say that it is an outcome, more or less, of those. So thank you, Ashok, for that question. Oh my gosh, all these questions are Ashok. I just realized that. Okay, well, come on, everyone else, ask some questions. I'll go ahead and keep on going with Ashok's. I think your examples given today gave me understanding on how the three pillars are outcomes that the foundation is built with 4 attributes you are focusing these webinars on. Good. That was my intent, that you have a deeper understanding. Of course, I can never go over as much in these webinars as I'd like. That's why I wrote a book. Okay, let's see. Oh, so Ashok is saying that he's used that experiment with his engineers and that it worked really well. That was Dan Markovitz that did it during the webinar in February, I believe it was. Let's see. Karen, will you be willing to share the selection matrix to calculate a score for selection of projects from? Yes, yes. So I won't be willing to share it until the book is out. I'm developing a new website, and I'm going to have a number of tools that are going to be available for free on the website, and that is one of them that is going to be a free tool available. But I'm still working through it. I have a professor at University of San Diego in the Industrial and Systems Engineering program that's actually helping me play around with it so that it's a sound tool. It was one thing to have a tool that had no math in it, and it's another thing to have a math-based matrix. And I'm not sold that you even need to have the math-based matrix. I think you can do just fine with the manual ease and benefit and just do the two-dimensional version. But for those that have a little higher level issues that they're dealing with, it might be worth using. Thank you, Ashok. Are there any other questions coming in, or is there anyone who'd like to raise their hand and have me unmute you so that you can ask verbally? That was kind of fun last month when we did that. Anybody? No takers for being brave and raising your hand? Okay, so if you could do me a favor, now I'm not going to unmute you if you raise your hand, but if you're writing a question, could you please raise your hand and let me know that you're writing? Because that was it for questions, and so I didn't know whether I should hang on or if we should go ahead and end the webinar. Is there anything that we have a few more minutes, is there anything I glossed over that you'd like me to go deeper into? I'm happy to do that. Okay, so Mike, I see your hand up, so I assume I'm going to put your hand down. Hillary, okay, so I see some questions coming in. Okay, good. I'm going to put your hands down. Now, if you put your hand up, it's going to mean you want to be unmuted and ask your question verbally. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask anything verbally. Okay, sounds like you guys are still writing your questions, so I'll hang on for a second. Should I sing the Jeopardy song? Do, 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 do. Let's see. You guys must be asking long questions. Let me see. All right, so I guess what I can do is share with you just a little bit on the discipline webinar that's coming up. So the discipline webinar is going to be primarily focused on building problem-solving capabilities in the organization and very much the role of the coach. So just to keep that in mind for the next webinar. Okay, questions coming from Mike. We have management support, but certain people in the team make changes that throw the team into a bit of a tizzy. How can we stay focused? Oh, Mike, I wish I could unmute you because I'd like to ask some follow-up questions. Raise your hand if you're okay with that, or if you don't have a mic, then I understand. I'll go ahead and start talking, but it's kind of tough without having a conversation. Oh, you don't have a mic. Okay. So one of the things I always wonder about when I hear this is whether or not there is a firm plan in place that's developed, that has good consensus in the beginning, and whether that plan's being worked. And what I mean by that is there should be weekly, monthly, at the least frequent meetings of all the people that are part of that planning process, wherever they are in the hierarchy of an organization. So if it's an executive plan, then the executive's there. If it's a middle management plan, middle managers come. And that's when people bring up the new projects they want to add to the table. And that's when you have these, good discussions about whether or not that new thing warrants moving something off the plate for right now, or whether or not it's a distraction that needs to be delayed until the next fiscal year or the next month or whatever. Okay, hang on. Good plan, meet weekly, not all members present every week. Okay, well, that's the problem. I mean, if someone's not present and they're not, or they're present and they're not speaking their mind on why you guys shouldn't be adding something to the list, then that's not going to necessarily, help you. So with the Ford meetings, that I haven't heard all the details about this, but I talked with someone who was going to those meetings at least for a while. It was mandatory. You had to be on that call. And so that's one thing. You might want to put greater discipline into the meetings and make sure that the meetings are highly, highly effective. So when people are given the latitude to not attend, that's a problem. Or when they come and they find that the meetings aren't effective, then that's another thing that could be a problem and making people not really want to come. So these meetings should be very agenda-based. Everyone presents their material quickly. There are questions, you move on. I mean, most organizations have plenty of initiatives that need to be run through in an hour meeting or a 45-minute meeting. Boom, 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 and those are the effective kinds of meetings. So without knowing any more of the details, it sounds to me that the plan and the consensus, the ongoing consensus around entertaining a new idea is part of the problem. I would recommend that you play around with that. Last question is, can you talk about how getting consensus on customer focus relates to prioritization projects, and what happens when there's disagreement on this at different levels in the organization? Let me read that again, Dawn. Can you talk about how getting consensus on customer focus relates to prioritization? I need a little clarification. Do you mean that you don't have consensus on what's value adding in the eyes of the customer, or do you mean that, can you talk about how getting consensus on customer focus? Yes. Okay, so you don't have agreement on what's value adding? Okay, well then you got to start there. If the team does not have agreement on what's considered to be value adding to the customer. So let me give you an example. In the case I just mentioned to you where it was a very tough prioritization thing and we started out with 51 or 3, whatever it was, one of the things that happened was the VP of sales, senior VP of sales, wanted a project to get on the prioritization list that was to create a new customer portal. And this would enable their customers to go in online and look at where all their work was. It was a service industry, and where their maintenance and repair. So where their requests were in the process and where they were in terms of having paid or not paid and all of these things. And everyone else, and I mean everyone else on the executive team, said, no, that is not our hottest priority. That's a nice to have, that's not a must have, and we have some must haves that they were private equity owned, so they had the must haves that the private equity firms said absolutely had to be dealt with this fiscal year. So it went back and forth, and with him lobbying why that's of high value to the customers, and the rest of the executive team said that is not high value. What's high value to them is us getting our work done more timely, at lower cost, getting their bills more correct. That's what's higher value to them right now. And he was theoretically the voice of the customer more than anyone else in that room because he was VP of sales, but he was one that eventually agreed to go with the list that did not have the customer portal on it for the sake of the greater good. And to this day, he's still unhappy it's not on the list, but he's, a mature leader that has agreed to go along with the list. So that discussion helped them get clarity on what value adding really is. Okay, so there's one more question, but I actually am not going to be able to answer that, so I'm so sorry. We're out of time, and I thank you all for coming. I hope that you're able to attend next week as well, and next month as well, and have a great rest of the day and a happy Easter, happy Passover. Thank you. Bye-bye.